Inspire. He malchus Yavan. Umucha mesnaged liYisrael. Mamashish Torah mitzvos elokoyus. The reason why Yavan was opposed to Klal Yisrael was we have Torah mitzvos which are godly, spiritual. It's not within the physical realm. Ki al malchus hu shaykh lo hachochma shu seichel ha'adam levad. The Greeks were the ultimate intellectuals, the philosophers, but their understanding was limited to what? To human intelligence. Today, we talk about artificial intelligence, but even artificial intelligence, that's human intelligence. Just has a greater grasp. But it all deals with the physical world. When we speak spiritual, it's a different realm of existence. Torah mitzvahs, even though it manifests itself in the physical, but its innate significance is spiritual. He refers to as Torah or mitzvahs elokoyos, the godly Torah mitzvahs. Lo seichel ha'elokia nivdol. It's not the godly mind which is totally removed from physical existence. She'at Torah elokoyos, which is the Torah which is godly. She'at seichel nivdol eloki legamri. It's an intellect which is removed from existence totally. We read in the end of Makos, the Mishnah, Rotza Kodesh Baruch Hu l'zakas Yisrael, l'fika chiyuv lem Torah mitzvos. Hashem wanted to bring merit to Klal Yisrael, therefore He gave us the abundance of Torah mitzvos. It is the famous Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos, in his commentary on the Mishnah. He asks a question. You'd think if we have less mitzvahs to contend with, there's a less likelihood of failure. But here He's given so many, so you have a greater chance of failure. So what do you mean, Lizakus Yisrael? So there's the famous Rambam, what he explains, that what is the objective of existence? It's a medium, it's a means to an end. We have challenges in this world, and if you meet the challenges, you perfect your soul, your neshamah, which allows you to have a relationship with God, with Hashem, to cleave to Him. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klaus, "Atem adveikim Hashem elokechem chaim kulchem yom." You adveikim, you attach yourself, you cleave to God, chaim kulchem yom, and if you do, that's the ultimate chaim. So I mentioned in the past what the Maharal explains. What's the source of all existence, of all life? God willing life. So if you connect yourself to the source of everything, you'll live continuously. You're connected to the eternal source of everything. Olam haba is what? It's a relationship with Hashem. Every Jew initially has a share in the world to come, meaning his neshamah, the profile of his soul, it's constructed that has relevance to have a relationship with Hashem, to cleave to Hashem. The non-Jew's neshama has no relevance to this. Only the Jew's neshama. The Jew has no share in the world to come unless he overtly does something unusually special. He's considered from the Hasidic Olam, devoutly religious of the worldly nations, and even then, what he merits is not what the Jew merits. His olam haba, his world to come, is a different world to come. Because the world to come of a Jew, it's rooted in what? In Torah mitzvahs. Torah mitzvahs are divine. Those are the mechanisms which were given to us to advance our neshamas, our soul. But why? Why we need matzah? Why does that advance your neshama? When you take a lulav, you sit in the sukkah. The Chavetz Chaim in every number of locations, in his introduction to the Chavetz Chaim, which he discussed the laws of Shmir Shaloshin, he mentions that in the name of Rav Chaim Vital, who was the one who recorded all the writings of the Arizal, he writes that just as we have Ramach Ivorim in the human body, 248 parts to the human body, the Ramach components, Chalokim, in Nishmas Yisrael, 248 components in the Jewish soul. We have Ramach Mitzvos, we have 248 positive commandments. Each Mitzvos corresponds to a component in the neshamah. And when you do the mitzvah, it infuses that component with a spiritual energy, which allows it to develop and advance itself. So through Torah mitzvahs, this is how we bring shleimus, bring completion to our neshamah. The neshamah is spiritual. Eat matzah, it's physical. You sit in the sukkah, it's physical. No, these are only symbolisms, representations of which activate those spiritual forces, which impact on our neshamas, that allow our neshama to be fully fleshed out in the spiritual context. A goy, a non-Jew, has no relevance to this. He doesn't even fathom what it is. The Maharal always speaks about the significance of number 7, number 8, and the Rabbeinu Bachis speaks about it also. 7 always connotes Teva. The natural order is 7. The world was created in 7 days. 8 is always supernatural. It supersedes the 7. We'll speak about it later. About there was 8 days. The oil burnt 8 days. Kabbalah Torah was on the 50th day. 50 is 7 times 7. It's beyond the 7. 50 always connotes spirituality. Shmini Atzeres. We don't sit in the sukkah. We don't take Daled meaning. Because 8 represents ultimately you're out of the realm of physicality. You don't need the protection of the sukkah. You don't the lulav, you have ward off the various, like Gemara says, ruchos ros, tlolim roim, all the destructive winds, destructive dews, you don't need it. Because when you cleave to the 8, to Hashem, you need no protection whatsoever. You assume a spiritual persona because you're attached at that level. But this whole concept, it's seichel elokim. The Greeks, when Noach said to Yefes, the Greeks are the sense of Yefes, Yavta elokim ba'olei shame. You will advance yourself in the tents of shame. Shame is Klal. That's the ultimate intellectualism. Except the difference is that the leshon of Jew is bound by the precepts of Hashem. The Greeks, wherever the mind can go, the mind goes there. Whether it's paganism, whatever it is, you could justify nothing as long as you can't refute it intellectually, you go there. The Jew has nothing to do. If it's contrary to what the dictates of the Torah, it's not acceptable. We're within limitation. The limitation is the spiritual. Hashem set those limits. If the Jews themselves would have embraced idolatry, we would have been revered by the Greeks. Because by us, the Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos, hafach bo tekula bo. The Torah itself is the blueprint for the world. That means there's nothing in the world on the most profound level of science, intellectualism, which is not rooted in the Torah. Because the Torah itself is the blueprint for the world. Hafach bo tekula bo. The more you delve the Torah, everything's in the Torah. Every branch of science, every concept, it's all there. So the Greeks saw that. So the Greeks appreciated the capacity of the Jew because they had relevance to that. But they couldn't handle circumcision, milah. If a person's born uncircumcised, how do you desecrate the body? Kedushah chodesh. We live within time. We don't control time. Limud Torah, the study of Torah also. It puts limitations. It locks down the mind. It locks down the emotion. You're forced to accept certain things. But that's contrary to what they understand intellectual is about. Intellectual is you go as far as you could go. And there's no stopping. Within the context of mitzvahs, there's no stopping. But once you go out of that, I'd once mentioned the name of Rav Chaim Volozhino. It says, Al Shlosheh Dvar Ma'olam Omeid. Torah, Avod, Gemilas, Chasodim. The world stands on three principles. Torah, Avod, Gemilas, Chasodim. We know that every one of the avos correspond to one of these components. Avraham Avinu was Chesed, Gemilas, Chasodim. Yitzchak was Avodah, and Yaakov was Torah. But yet, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi authored the Mitzvah, he says, Torah, Avodah, Gemilas, Chasodim. Why Torah? Why Torah first? Should have said Gemilas Chasodim, Avodah, and Torah. So the Rav Chaim Volozhin explains it this way. Before Kabbalah Torah, if a Jew wanted to do chesed, and you wanted to lend money with interest, was that chesed? Regardless of what the percentage of interest is. That's chesed. A Jew who wants to pay interest to a Jew. The lender is willing to give without interest, but the Jew insists to pay. Both the lender and the borrower, both in violation of ribis, of usury. Torah says when you give a loan, you cannot take interest. Before Sinai, what was that? That was chesed. Why shouldn't it be chesed? Before Sinai, if you wanted to build a mizbeach, an altar, and bring a korban, it's permitted, as long as you brought it for God. Once we had a mishkan, and we had a Beis Hamikdash, you bring that korban outside the Beis Hamikdash, outside the mishkan, it's called shchutei chutz, it's called haktoras chutz, carries liability of koris. So what was permitted pre-Sinai, which was the ultimate avodah, after Sinai, God says it's unacceptable. So as a result of that, Rav Chaim Volozhin says like this: First, you have to know what the Torah says. Once you understand the guidelines of the Torah, now we can talk about avodah. Avodah is only within the Mishkan, within the Beis Hamikdash. Gemilas Chasodim. What's chesed? Chesed is if you meet the criteria of the Torah. You lend money, cannot be ribis. If it is ribis, the Gemara tells us in Bava Metzia, and afro ninal tchis hamesim, that person will not be resurrected. That's how extreme it is. So everything's predicated on Torah. Torah avod gemilas chasodim. But why isn't it chesed? The borrower wants to pay. God says it's not acceptable. You want to serve God, bring it, korban, wherever you want to bring it. God says no. You bring it, has to be brought in a specific location. And the location has to meet certain criteria. Otherwise, it's not acceptable. So what is the prerequisite to everything? Torah, avod, gemilas chasodim. That's Rav Chaim Volozhin. I once asked the question, in two locations, it tells us, when a child begins speaking, what are the first two psukim we have to teach him? The first pasuk you teach him is, Torah tziv alonu Moshe Moshe Kilas Yaakov. That's the first pasuk you teach him. Second pasuk you teach him is, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That's the sequence of what you're teaching. So it bothered me immediately when I learned it. It seems to be, what is the fundamental of Jewish belief? Yichud Hashem, the unity of Hashem. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So don't you think the first thing you should teach a child is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad? Then you teach him Torah Tziv Alonu Moshe. The answer is no. First you teach him Torah Tziv Alonu. Everything is guided and bound by what the Torah says. It says it is or is not. Once you know what the Torah says, now we can talk about what Yichud Hashem is. Until you know what the Torah says, you don't even know what Yichud Hashem is. You could believe, who knows what you could believe. If everything's predicated on Torah Tziv Alonu Moshe, Moshe Kilas Yaakov. Then we could talk about Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Same idea. So the whole concept of divine intelligence versus physical intelligence, it's a different realm of reality. The Greeks were outstanding in physical intelligence, but seichel eloki, but a divine seichel, intellect, that they had no realms to. Only the Jew had, and that's what they couldn't tolerate. Measures that Rebbe Kiva, he always used to debate the Roman governor of Shammai. His name was Tonus Truppus. And the Medrash cites one of the debates. And Rebbe Kiva had the opening question. Whose action is more perfect? Man's or God's? So Tonus Truppus said, of course, God's. He says, I disagree. Man's actions are more perfect, he says. You believe in God, that's the way you talk. So Rekiva says to him, I want to ask you a question. You have a kernel of wheat, which is edible, and you take the kernel and you mill it, turn it into flour, turn it into dough, and you bake it, and you have a complete loaf of bread. What's more perfect? What's more edible? The raw kernel or the finished baked product? Finished baked product. So what does that say? That God created an imperfect world, and the objective of mankind is to perfect God's world. That's what Rebbe Kiva said. So Tonus Truppus says to Rebbe Kiva, he says, something's always bothered me about you Jews. God created a person with a foreskin, a male, and the Jew goes and mutilates the child, removes the foreskin. So Reb Kiva says to him, he says, but that's what we're discussing. The person who's created with a foreskin, he's incomplete. When you remove the foreskin, you bring in the person to a level of completion. So the Chaim HaKadosh explains over there, I mean, it's a simple equation. You shift from the loaf of bread to the foreskin, but yet he didn't get it. Tonus Truppus, the Roman government didn't get it. Why? So he explains exactly what the Maharal was saying. In terms of the kernel of wheat, which is physical, and the loaf of bread, which is physical, we understand it's more perfected, it's tastier, and it's more developed, the finished loaf of bread after milling it, after kneading it, after baking it. But in terms, if God created a human being with a foreskin, evidently that's what he's supposed to be. So what are you mutilating the child, removing the foreskin? You're damaging the perfect body. So Chaim HaKadosh says, this Tonus Truppus, he didn't understand the whole concept of spiritual perfection. Within the physical, he understands. But if physically that's the way you are, what do you accomplish by cutting off the foreskin? How does that have some kind of ramification and makes a difference to the person? Just to the contrary, it minimized the person. Now, the Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim, that's Guide for the Perplexed, that one of the reasons why Hashem gave us milah was because when you remove the foreskin, you're damaging to a degree the male organ, and as a result of that, you're curbing the desire for sexual activity. It tempers one's sexuality, one's desire for sexual behavior. That's what the Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim. So if that's the case, just the opposite. That's what the Eternal Shabbos says. What does this have to do with the kernel of wheat? There you've perfected it. Here you've diminished the person. He's less functional. The way they learned, one of the Farshim, Yosef would only give the food during the Rov, the famine years, only if they would first circumcise themselves. Otherwise, he wouldn't give them the food. Wouldn't sell them the food. They went to complain to Paro. So Paro says, but you knew it was coming, the famine. Why don't you store away the wheat? He says, we did. But Yosef decreed it should rot. So Paro said to them, if he decreed the wheat should rot, what happens if he decrees that you should die? You better listen to circumcise yourselves. So they all ask, well, what was the whole idea? Why did Yosef want them to be circumcised? The answer is, what was Egypt? What was that whole society? The environment was what? They were immersed in sexual
Shtufe
zima, exactly. So he wanted to elevate them because he was preparing for the Golos, that his family was coming to elevate them. They shouldn't be totally immersed in this kind of life because now it would curb it. That's how they explain it based on this Mar Nevuchim. So Thomas Trubbis, what does he understand? Just the opposite. The male is more functional with the foreskin. By removing it, you're damaging him. But it has nothing to do with this. Because if you understand what the foreskin represents, it represents, based on the Zohar, the evil of the Eitz Hadas. That's Tov Ra. So by cutting that away, that opens all spiritual channels that the Jew should be able to advance himself. But what does he understand? His intellect is limited to the physical, has no relevance to the spiritual, can't fathom it, can't relate to it. So therefore, what did they do? One of the decrees was Jews were not permitted to what? To circumcise themselves. If they would, it was punishment by death. Shabbos, limited, 7th day of the week. You can't be productive physically speaking. Can't. Why? If I can be creative in this, that's the ultimate. The whole purpose of man is to be creative activities. Why do you put a limitation on the human being? Therefore, these are things they couldn't tolerate. Milah and Belzemeshlo, milah elokis kedusha. The Beis Hamikdash, it's a physical edifice, but its innate value, it has milah elokis, kedushah. It has a spiritual, godly distinction, which is elevated. Hein kimisnagdim biyoselo. So what represents the ultimate level of spirituality, which is limitation, you're bound to that. It's something they couldn't tolerate it. Hamalchus hazos ki Torah uBeis Hamikdash hem shtei madreg zolzu. We say when we finish the Shmon Esrei every day, we say, Shibar Beis Hamikdash may remain seichel kein seichel. There's a linkage between Yibar Beis Hamikdash b'meir Yameinu and give us a share in the Torah. If you're connected at that level, you receive your share. You are able to come upon the understanding of the Torah itself. Rambam brings this. שיבור בסמיגות שמי וימינו, שכל בשור שכל, מושו בבור במקום אחר, לקח, או מסנגדים אל המצווס התורה. Therefore they were opposed vehemently, even decree punishment by death, or Beis Hamikdash, the Frat. What did the Greeks do? They took a swine and they slaughtered the Beis Hamikdash. That's what they did. What are the kosher species? You want to serve, you bring whatever you want. Blemish, not blemish, doesn't make a difference. The Gemara tells us in Shavuos that a person who's moshech or loso elo chaylu mabo, a person who's circumcised, then artificially you cause yourself to look uncircumcised. You pull the foreskin back forward, and the male organ becomes covered. That's called moshech or loso. So many of the Jews during the Hellenistic period, because they used to perform in the publicly naked, and this was the amphitheaters. So they would be naked. So to be circumcised was a disgrace. The body was disgraced. So they would go and they'd be moshech or loso. They'd artificially cause the foreskin to grow again to cover the organ. So the Maharal asks, factually, he is circumcised. Once he's circumcised, Now that you look artificially uncircumcised, but you're still circumcised. So if you're circumcised, why no chilul mabo? What do you not have share in the world to come? That's a question asked by the Maharal of Prague. The Maharal answers, because what's the concept of milah? The milah itself is the bris kodesh. You want to identify with God. But if you want to identify in a way where you have no connection to Hashem, you don't want to have a connection with God, then you have no shame in the world to come. The world to come is having a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. See, even though halachically you are circumcised, but since your statement by being Moshe Oloso, causing yourself to look artificially uncircumcised, you have no share in the world to come. That was the Greek Olympics, the disc throwers, the pole vault things. They performed naked. Now, after World War I, after World War II, the majority of children born in the United States in the hospitals, even non-Jews, were circumcised. Today, much less. Because they said that this whole idea, many of the doctors in the hospitals were Jews. Usually a child was circumcised before the mother was released from the hospital. And they said, it's a Jewish conspiracy. The Jews are trying to circumcise all children, Jew or not, because they want to have their imprint. That's going to influence them. And therefore, there was a movement that the children should not be circumcised. I'm not sure today. You got to Google what today the percentage of children, non-Jewish children. In the 50s and 60s, the majority of non-Jews were circumcised. Since then, where they said there was this Jewish conspiracy by doctors, because they said the majority of doctors in hospitals are Jews, make sure to circumcise them. Because you'll have control over society if you circumcise them. So the nest that took place during Chanukah, it was the candles of the Beis Hamikdash, the menorah. Kiner mitzvah v'torah. The ner is the mitzvah. That's the receptacle, the oil, the wick. But what illuminates, that's Torah. Ushmona yomim shnas lehem hanes. This is again the Maharal. 8. What's the significance number 8? Mora al malas haTorah. That displays the milah of Torah, the special distinction of Torah. Kmo shibarn biarnu mokam acher. It's interesting, in Lametzeach, we say on Shabbos, the eighth pasuk in Lametzeach, Mizvah David. Over there, it says, Hashem Yisabrin Kokel, Masi Yadom Agin Rakia, Yom Liyom Bi Omer. This is what we say in Shabbos. The 8th pasuk is, Kudei Hashem Yisharm Samchi Lev. The dictates Hashem al Yisharm Sam. That's the 8th pasuk in that parak of Tehillim. So Maharal says, why is it the 8th pasuk? Because Torah is l'malam min ha'teva. After 7 comes Torah. So here he says something similar. The Hu Yosad Mizmor Asher Ismi Derech ala Torah. Betamni Ape. It's repeated. The Al Beis mentioned 8 times. Both say there Lamtzeh Mizlo David Hashemayim Sarvin Kel. Here he says it here. Shiva Psukim. The first 7 psukim speak about the physical existence. V'acha Shiva Psukim. It says Torah Hashem Temimo. Mishiva Snovesh. The 8th pasuk in that capital, in that parak, is Torah Hashem Temimo. That's 8. Ki Elub Zay Psukim Hein Olam Hazeh. The first 7 psukim are referring to this creation. Shemaim Sepul Kel, Masi Yadov Bagid Rakia. V'atorhi al Olam Hazeh. Shu Nivra B'zayin Mei Brishis. The Torah transcends the physical world, which was created over a 7-day period. So what's the 8th level? The 8th level is Torah. That's Madriga Shminus. That transcends the physical. Shiva Shvuos Tispaloch. Now we speak about Sphira. Shiva Shvuos Tispaloch Ad HaChamishim until the 50th. Shu Acha Shiva. The 50th is the 8 that follows the 7. That's Kabbalah Torah. Umatan Torah. Those are biyar barichus mokum acher. Kachaneshel Chanukah roy shiyeh shmoni yom zachaser. Therefore, what's the ness of Chanukah? It's an 8-day, spans an 8-day period. Vod yisbar tam l'zeh. He says he'll continue explaining it and expanding this concept. The Gemara says in Sukkah that Shmini Atzeres is Chag b'fnei atzmo. Right? Pazer Kashov. We say Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. We don't say the Sukkah Shmini Atzeres. It's connected, but it has its own identification, its own identity. So the Medrash says, take a look in the Yalkut. In truth, Shmini Atzeres should have been 50 days after Sukkah starts. So what, like Shavuos, and it says, just like Shavuos is 50 days after Pesach starts, Shmini Atzeres should have been 50 days later. Why is it not? Because Sukkot falls out is pre-winter. So if Hashem would say, come back 50 days later, you'd have to trudge through the snow and the mud. It would cause tremendous hardships for Klal Yisrael to come back. If Hashem says, something, make it easy. Immediately Sukkot is over, the 8th day, that's Shmini Atzeres. So you shouldn't have to trudge back. So it's interesting. So in reality, the Shmini Atzeres is really 50. It should have been 50 days later. As Shavuos is 50 days after Yetzias Mitzrayim. What do you think we have Simchas Torah on Shmini Atzeres? Again, because the ultimate of spirituality is the Torah itself. Therefore, it's on the 8th day. We complete Torah on the 8th day. Really, you should complete it 50 days later, like Kabbalah Torah was 50 days later. There's a brisa in Shabbos, mitzvos Chanukah. What is the mitzvah Chanukah? Ner ishu beiso. You light a candle for your home. One candle. Hamahadrin, if you want to do it in a more elaborate way, each member of the household should have his own candle. Hamahadrin, minimahadrin, if you want to be exceptionally, do it at an exceptional level, you start with 8. And as the days go on, you diminish them. 8, 7, 6, and that's where you go. No. Yom Rishon Madlik Achas, 1 candle. And every day you add another candle. Every consecutive day, you're increasing the number. Omer Ula, what's the machlokus? Whether you go in an upward direction or a descending order. The 2 Amorom argue this in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yossi bar Ovin, Rabbi Yossi bar Zvido. These are the 2 Amorim. Charoma Taimed ve Shammai Keneged Yomim Hanichnosim. The 8 corresponds to how many days are we about to celebrate? Tamed ve Hillel Keneged Yomim Hayotzim, the days that we're observing, first day, second day. Charoma Taimed ve Shammai Keneged Pori Achag, the oxen that were brought on Sukkot, they what? They diminished. Every day there were less and less oxen. When it comes to kedushah, you always advance kedushah. You don't diminish kedushah. So you start 1, and every day you up it. You up the ante. Omer Rabbi Chana, Omer Rabbi Chana, Shnei, the Canaan, Hoyubi, Satan. There were 2 elders in Sidon. Echor also ki Beis Shammai. One conducts the Beis Shammai. Started with the whole number and went down, descending order. Echor also did Beis Hillel. So no stam Dvorov. One explains to correspond to the oxen of brought on sukkahs, that they diminish. You start with the large number, go down. The advanced kedushah, you don't diminish kedushah. Okay, I think we're going to stop here this week to be continued.